waterfall.
It's kind of difficult to drink my wine all fancy like.
I like the gold rim on your glass.
I know, it's especially ridiculous.
It's very fancy.
Okay.
All right. We are live and on air. It's Jamaica Utopia. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our first broadcast. Coming at you live and in charge. We are here to take a noble stance of liberation, revolution, and love. We're going to do it, baby. Up the good vibes. That's where we're headed. A better world, a better place. More people will be joining us shortly, but this broadcast will be recorded and put up on our website after we are done. So, while we are waiting for people to come in, we can just we can hang out for a little bit, or we can say our names.
That'd probably be a good thing to do, like name and pronoun round.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then as people join up, we can just be like, "Hey, welcome to the live stream. What's your name and pronouns?"
Sure. All right. We got several people saying they're going to jump on here.
You know what I realized?
What?
It's kind of irrelevant to use, or depending on what Gmail you use, it's kind of irrelevant to use code names. So
yeah, it's not ideal for me. I didn't feel like I really wanted to create a new account just for fun. But maybe I will for next time. It's more, you know, the
aesthetic.
Yeah. I got you. So how's everybody doing?
You're good. How are you?
Doing all right. I had a fun day today. I saw the Grim Reaper.
You saw the Grim Reaper?
Yeah, I'm gonna die.
Woo!
I was out wandering around with a friend, and we ended up at a park, and I think some like students were doing like a film thing, and someone was dressed up as the Grim Reaper with like a straight up scythe, like a metal fucking scythe. It was really weird. And like where we were was like a park with like a baseball field and stuff, and the Grim Reaper person was just like standing in the middle of the baseball field. It was weird. It was very strange. And we were talking about like really like heavy philosophy stuff, and then it just like my friend like looks over my shoulder. I'm like, "What are you looking at?" And
I guess we've got 9 viewers, so we may as well.
Yay!
Well, just go ahead. Welcome, everybody, to our first DU Live extravaganza. Are you ready? Are you willing? Are you ready to go there? Are you ready to be liberated? Let's do it. Okay. So, introductions. Who do we have here? Let's do a little roundabout of names and pronouns. Who wants to go first? Popcorn.
Deerheart, he, they.
My name is Wishbone, and my pronoun is he, please.
Slippery Elm. She, they.
I am String Bean, and you can use any pronoun. Just mix it up. Sweet deal, folks. So we're all glad that you're here, fellow neighbors. So we're gonna move in. Our first point on our discussion today is current events. We're gonna talk a little bit about what is going on in the world. And so real quick, you know, we've got here in the Northwest some interesting stuff going on. I don't know how many of you folks that are here watching this are in the Northwest, but we have been suffering from massive fires everywhere, burning up, and smoke that we are inhaling. It's a new, wonderful Northwest summer tradition. So real quick, we're gonna show you a video, and then we'll get into it.
Eating through thousands of acres of forest, so large it's visible from space. The flames have destroyed more than 800 homes, counting. The statistics are stunning, but the personal stories hit hardest. You could see the flames in your rearview mirror.
Yes, that was the terrifying part. It was like a wall of fire. It was like a train. It had a noise. It was awful. I thought I was on a sci-fi movie.
Driving away from a home you may never see again.
And that's what happened. But lots and lots and lots of memories. Yeah, they're gone. I mean, everything's gone.
Everything?
Everything.
What did you manage to say?
So, folks, that is what we are dealing with. We're dealing with massive fires here. So, I guess, like, what are y'all thinking about the flames, the fires? It's all feeling pretty dystopian out there in the world these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just like being in Seattle, it's been really, really disheartening. Well, I don't know. Okay. So on the one hand, like we've been hit really, really hard by smoke, and like there were several days where it was just straight up difficult to be outside because you couldn't breathe. And because of the like housing or the large houseless population here, like I know how difficult it was for me to be out there, and I have a home and I can like take refuge from the smoke, and I can't imagine like how that must feel to be houseless and have to deal with that. On the other hand, it was really, really heartening to see I think it's like Seattle Human Services or like Housing Services or something. On one of the really, really bad days, there was just a little van driving around, and like if they saw people that either they recognized as houseless or that were like likely dealing with like major smoke inhalation issues, like they were just going around and being like, hey, let's get you someplace safe, which like, you know, it's Seattle. Like you take what you can get there. But I think for us up here, like it's definitely something to consider as a point of organization, like being able to make sure that like people have N95 masks available at all times during the summer, because this is going to be a regular occurrence, unfortunately.
Hey.
It makes me think of a couple things. It makes me think of the writings of Octavia Butler, particularly Parable of the Sower, where constant fires are one of the main features of the dystopian world in which they're living and trying to escape from. And of course, what happens in that story is they try to escape up the 5 from Southern California, and so that we already see, you know, the fires are here as well. They're, you know, just not just in the desert, but they're coming on up the coast. That in spite of how dystopian Octavia Butler's vision of the future was, that it is in fact worse. But at the same time, it makes me think of Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, which is about these kind of like small moments of utopian gestures where communities come together and care for each other when everything else seems to be falling apart. And it's kind of inspiring to see that happen, but at the same time, really discouraging to think that that's what it takes. Why should it have to take that? You know?
Yeah.
And
I've been thinking,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, the whole wildfire things has me thinking a lot about, you know, just the history of the place we live in, you know.
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that, like, you know, all the settlers who live here, all of us, and white folks sit here and think that, like, oh shit, this is the end of the world, you know, like the world is burning down, the forests are being burnt up. But like, the actual truth of the matter is that this has been happening for generations, right? Like over 500 years on this continent, and longer than that everywhere else in the world.
Millennia. There are trees in the south, in like the southeastern United States, that literally don't grow unless they're exposed to wildfires.
Definitely a part of the natural, like, ebb and flow, but I think like the intensity of these fires are something that is really different and unique, and that is a product of the sort of forest management policy that, you know, we've implemented, you know, out there, that's purely about resource extraction, where we monocrop a lot of the forested areas that don't provide a lot of the underbrush and things like that that help create natural cycles, where that also prevent some of it just from going totally you know, crazy to the point where you have entire regions just covered in smoke. And I think that's the thing, is like, we have a combination of like increasingly drier climates and this like forest management policy that, you're right, like, you know, looks at wildfires as a problem, but only in the sense of like resources, in the sense that it's a loss of these trees and resources that it wants to keep going.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was thinking more in the sense of like.
Sorry for cutting you off, by the way.
No, that's okay. I was thinking more in the sense of like, you know, there's this like dystopic malaise that people see like these wildfires as being like, oh shit, the signal's like, you know, some apocalyptic, you know, future or whatever. But like, for most of the people who are living here before white people came, like, that shit's already happened, and like has been happening continuously since colonization.
Wishbone, are you saying that that the loss of a way of life, the loss of homes, the loss of one's you know, like connection to the lands that you lived on, like that loss that the woman in the video is talking about, is something that's been happening to the indigenous folks on this continent since colonization began? Is that the connection that you're drawing?
Yes, exactly. And even like Stringbean was saying, is like, you know, the forests that we have now are far and away different than they were when, you know, indigenous folks were managing all the forests, and they are very fire prone. But either way, like, the way that they look now is not what they were 200 years ago. And, you know, there's this continuous cycle of just, you know, resource extraction and violence against people and the earth that, you know, this is just, seems to me to be just a new version of, in a sense.
There was
So Brianna Miss Rex chirped in and says, most of our fires are on second and third growth forests too, right? Stuff that's already been clear cut.
Yeah, and when those forests regrow. Sorry,
I'm looking for something on my broadcasting device. Yeah, there it is. Sorry, go ahead. I may have derailed a little bit.
No, it's fine. I was just gonna say, like, whoever commented that, they're 100% right. Like, all these forests where all these fires are happening aren't old growth forests. They are matchsticks, right? Second and third growth forests that, you know, trees grow on each other. Like, yeah, they're just like less than 3 feet apart. It's wild.
There's a really so 99% Invisible, which is a podcast, did a really great episode about forest management and kind of like the very like Anglo-centric, property-centric ways that forest management has been going on more or less since like we came here. And I highly recommend checking it out. I want to say the episode is called Fire and Rain. It talks about like forest management, and as well as like water management. Good episode. I learned a lot.
Yeah, it's it's a really important thing. I think this is kind of the root of social ecology, is asking, what is humans relationship to the natural world, right? And we have these
Yeah.
of first, second, third nature, and part of like becoming human is like having these certain abilities to make and craft and change the world, but becoming more human means realizing our position in being stewards of the land. And so I think these questions about like how we manage our and how we use like our ecosystems and how we treat them and respect them is like an essential point to social ecology. And I think it's a really important thing to like continue pushing forward. There's a lot of I remember reading this book Utopia that's kind of got some different things going on in it, but one of the big things that was cool to me reading it was the way that they had people like living in the forests who were the people who were like they kind of managed the forest, and if you wanted some like timber from the forest, you had to like come up and work up there and tend the land and take care of the trees for a certain amount of time before you were able to like gain access to that resource. And it was an individual thing. Any person that wanted to use it had to do it. So eliminated the need for huge companies with the ability for them to sort of just do this ruthless exploitative thing that they have going on. But I think like this conversation brings us to kind of the bulwark of our livecast episode here today, and that'd be a good time to move into that. So the first topic point is dystopia. Hey! And so the first point is, what is the Greek root of the word dystopia? Dys, meaning abnormal, impaired, difficult, or bad. Topia, meaning place. So dystopia, that's the kind of the root of the word. And in popular imagination, we have a lot of dystopian stuff going on. We have zombies. We've got movies about natural disasters constantly, giant tornadoes, giant waves, sharknadoes even. I mean, we're getting imaginative with our dystopian, perspective. They're all, so 1984, Brazil, these are all...
Brave New World.
Brave New World. These are all examples of dystopian fiction, right? So I guess the first question is, how do folks feel like dystopia works in the radical imagination? Is there room for dystopian imaginations? Can that be something that is liberatory in some ways? 1984 being again a sort of political polemic, and a lot of these movies being ways of critiquing sort of our systems that stand. So in what ways does dystopian thought do that, and in what other ways are we living in a dystopia? I think other examples of sort of dystopian fiction are the cyberpunk genre that offers images of like huge corporate prolific hellholes and the kind of outsider figure navigating those faceless bureaucracies. So how does dystopia work in a context of any liberatory way? Is there any room for that?
Well, narratives have like, they can offer, they can present a dystopic vision and then suggest ways in which it might be transcended, or ways in which something good can grow out of it. That if through choices and working together, collaboration, commitment, that there's a way past it. So like, I think about, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler is like always my go-to. And in that story, there's a vision of like what could be and how to create it. But 1984, for example, is, I mean, there's nothing good. At the end, his you know, the main character's you know, brief, you know, touch with something different was actually just a ploy to find out who would be susceptible to such things, and then he's shunted back into re-education. There's no hope. And so I think dystopia can be great if it opens up as a narrative genre, if it opens up the possibility for some kind of future that we have to work really, really hard to get, but that would be more of what we want, or indeed perhaps even a utopia. But, you know, a lot of times dystopia can just, you know, shut things down and leave us in a place where we feel unmotivated to do anything because it just all seems hopeless.
So I can't remember which philosopher said this. I want to say it's Nietzsche, but it might be another person like in that vein, who talks about how a lot of times like our political identities are formed in response to oppression that we experience. And this is only on my mind because I was literally just talking, like having a conversation about this stuff earlier. And I think for radical politics, like even us as utopians, as we work towards utopia, dystopia helps to kind of like hone that vision of what a utopia looks like. So like for like, or it helps us to kind of better understand how a utopic principle or a element of society that we feel is going to be inherent within utopia can be perverted into like horrible means. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at, Slip, is that like, you know, as we agitate farther and farther towards utopia, we need to be mindful of how like dystopia and dystopic elements can kind of creep into this. And like in that way, it kind of calls into mind Alexander Reed Ross's Against the Fascist Creep, which a lot of that book is about how like ostensibly left movements can be I don't want to say infected because that doesn't feel right, but I'm going with it.
I understand, yeah.
With like elements of fascism and this kind of like tendency towards cruelty to justify like seemingly contradictory actions within our own like political development.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with Deerhard here. Like, you know, the idea of like this dystopian mindset or dystopian vision, like being the thing that people counterpose against, right? I've been listening to a lot of talks by David Graeber, and one that really struck me was he was giving like a short course on like on indigenous folks, and he said that there's a lot of cases that he studied where you know, in people living in you know, land-based societies, egalitarian societies, base themselves their own values against like those of another type. So like egalitarianism versus like hierarchical kingdoms and stuff like that, and people are like, oh yeah, no, we don't want to be a kingdom, like that's fucked up because like that's just oppression and people are being killed all the time. And you know, there's so many ways that dystopia not just as an idea, but like as a literary element, like you're saying, Slippery, it's like it can also be a way of self critique almost, and also like in popular media even, you know, taking today's world, ratcheting things up one step farther and saying, oh shit, where does this take us, right?
But this is the kind of thing about it, like, you know, both dystopia and utopia are kind of like looking towards the future, right? Where like dystopia, like often when you watch this fiction, like a lot of times it is a closed circuit, but that's the difference between like, you know, Thomas More's kind of like definition of utopia, who's we have on here to talk about in a second, but you know, they're the person that kind of created the idea or the notion, but it was really one of like stagnant, like perfect circular systems that strove to like a total functionalism system, right? And that's kind of not the utopia that we're talking about. We're talking about like utopia in the context of a place we never reach, you know, and so that's kind of points in when we get to it is you being the root meaning no, and utopia being place. So literally, it means being place. So it's sort of a you know, I like to think of it as what the Zapatistas say. The struggle is like a circle. You can begin wherever you want, but the struggle never ends. So like what we define as a, you know, a better world will always be evolving with every step that we make, and we should always be striving and setting our sights on a sort of better world, right? And so I think that's one of the ways that, you know, so one of the things that I want to probe is like, you know, with this kind of context of dystopian thought, right? Like it playing into like maybe like giving us some realizations about like the potential if we basically just allow things to go on sort of as they are. And we can, I think of like Black Mirror and the sort of political commentary that a lot of that has by making these kind of dystopian, like, you know, total control societies, like not as far off as something like cyberpunk, but something that you can actually really see going with one element of technology just going a little bit further, like, you know, a new economy based on likes. There's an episode on that sort of thing. So,
which was inspired by real events.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's the power of it is like kind of we are really kind of at the brink, and that's the thing where I think we were hoping this conversation would go was, you know, politically in this, you know, country, we have a situation where there's a lot of sort of policies and things set in place that a few years ago would have been thought, you know, while these things are definitely developing, you know, such as these border walls already in existence, but very quietly. And now, you know, now we've seen a full-scale embrace of a full-scale sort of, you know, embracement of the cruel, embracement of the bad, of a sort of dystopia of, you know, it's fight or flight, and it's survive, choose your crew, and we're going to, you know, build these walls. The military realizes that climate change is happening. They have studies on it, and, you know, and there's a...
Yeah, they know it's a security threat.
Right. A friend of mine is reading a book all about the policy leaders building these walls as a part of keeping out climate refugees, which I think kind of ties it all back in. So anyways, I guess like part of it for me is also with the far right kind of evangelical stuff. I think there's deep rooted myths in our society and culture around, you know, the sort of Christian apocalypse, you know, this notion that we have to go through this like terrible time to reach, you know, salvation or a better world or whatever. And we see a lot of that with our Christian, far right, Christian right now. Just full on embracing the idea of like the apocalyptic situation in the end of the world. So I wonder in what ways those kind of deep-rooted narratives play into to the left. Do we interact with these things?
God.
Have we overly participated this future vision of the world, and has that guided our actions? You know, are we, you know, preparing for this apocalyptic situation, or should we You know, are we contextualizing our lives and our struggles and like an inevitability of total zombie apocalypse, right? As a narrative a lot of people neglect. The zombie apocalypse, like, or should we be, you know, demanding something a little bit different?
I feel like the conversation that I had with my friend earlier today, like, previewed all of the stuff that we're talking about today. Because, like, I was talking to them about how, like, especially within, like, specific, like, tendencies of Marxism, there's this weird, like, millenarianism associated with it that, like, people or some Marxists like associate with revolution itself. Like, we just got to get the revolution, and then after that, things will be good, right? And I'm not convinced by that. I'm not convinced that, like, you know, if we take like previous Marxist revolutions like at their word, like the acquisition of state power is not necessarily the best thing. And especially now, as the nation state like exists in a more like powerful and pervasive way than it did in the early 1900s, like, if a revolutionary movement were to take control of the United States, that fucking terrifies me. Because, like, at least with the government that we have now, there are in the age of Trump, that may be an exception. But, like, there are some established, like, political norms that prevent people from doing X, Y, or Z thing. Like, you're not going to have someone walk into the Oval Office and push the big red button that launches all the nukes. But again, in the age of Trump, that may be a total, like, that may be a different thing. So, like, I think that something that Demand Utopia is very conscious of is the fact that, like, when we say Demand Utopia, we're engaging in this almost like dialectical process of achieving utopia. Like, you don't, to steal something from our dear comrades in Seriously Wrong, like, there are these utopes, these steps towards a better future. And that better future is out there. We're going to move towards it. It's going to take a while. But the point is we're moving towards it. I feel like it is a ramble completely.
No.
I mean, that's the thing for me, you know, that I think about is, like, really at the end of the day, it's like there could, you know, like, I think about stuff in the realm of, like, anything is possible, however unlikely. However unlikely, there's always, like, a small percentage that anything could happen, right? And, like, oftentimes, like, in revolutions, it's like the political expert revolutionaries who expected it the least. You know, I know when, like, Occupy kind of happened, at least here in the United States, a lot of, like, old shrewd, like, leftists have been around forever, like, oh my God, I did not expect that at all, you know? And, you know, so it's like, I think about it like, you know, yeah, it's true, like, you know, what some of the insurrectionaries say about, like, instantaneous spontaneity, like, sure, like, there's always that possibility that we can all just flip a switch and one day decide, like, fuck this, like, there's some, like, you know, totally other, you know, thing that we should be doing. But I think, like, you know, partially, you know, we have to build communities, and how that looks is, like, a complicated question, but we have to, like, develop some ethics and a perspective first and foremost about, like, what the world could be. Because if you don't have that radical imagination, then that's a skill to, like, develop that, to be able to imagine a totally different, like, context of, you know, wealth redistribution, to social norms, to personal interactions. When you've been socialized in a system that only gives you one thing, it's hard to imagine a different way of being, you know, at all. So it's like, that's why utopian thought, I think, is just super important. And so
I want to, if I have a chance, like, I want to come back to this question about, like, this idea of suffering and the way, and the notion that we have to suffer in order to get something good, and that only until we, like, are thoroughly miserable, you know, do we deserve to have something better. and so that we should somehow embrace this misery as the prelude to something good.
Weirdly Christian.
Yeah, and I think it's just as influential on the right as it is on the left. I think about, recently I was talking about our stuff and somebody was like, this is just ostentatious. And because this idea that we would be able to have all of these things that we would want to have in what our utopia might be, that this person was very much like, no, we can't have those things. We have to like get smaller. We have to have less. We have to, we're only going to survive if we really, get close together and shed all of our, modern conveniences and just go back to living in this kind of primitivistic way. And I just am kind of like aghast at that, because in my utopia there's indoor plumbing.
Yeah.
Glasses.
Ostentatious.
What?
Being ostentatious.
Yes, you are. Yes. Well, yes. And as you can see, I'm playing that up with my jewelry in my utopia.
No, I think you're so on point with that, because like, not only is it like that kind of like self-flagellation of being like, oh, I haven't suffered enough, so I don't deserve enough. Like, that's just like bullshit. Number one, like everyone deserves food, housing, shelter, and love. Like all those things, just straight up, just by virtue of existence. It's like a very anti-human rights narrative almost, and kind of proto-fascist in a sense. But also like, it just doesn't have appeal. Like if you're gonna like go door knock your neighborhood,
that's a big thing.
And you say like, oh, like get rid of all your shit and like join my commune where we have like all this Kool-Aid. Like no one's gonna want to do that, and like you should tell people that.
That's not a political movement. That's a cult formation.
Yeah, and it's like, I think there's definitely a certain point beyond which like, material goods are kind of superfluous for a lot of folks.
Absolutely.
But, just jumping straight to that point and saying like, hey, you should ditch all this stuff that you've worked for, and like join us. Like, it's not, you're not gonna have a deal with that message. I just had a wardrobe malfunction.
Well, yeah, I wanted to bring it back to what you were saying earlier, Wishbone, about like David Graeber bullshit jobs, and this whole idea of like, we have to struggle to get what we want. I feel like it's just like such a powerful like mythology that like is behind like so much of the far right, like fascistic sort of like tendencies around us right now, and like. And it starts off with like, I mean, you can look at it in terms of like the labor force and what kind of jobs, do we prioritize giving a lot of money to, and it's like, well, if you're doing like these really kind of benign, like pointless jobs, that aren't really serving any greater social good, or, let's give you a lot of money. And then, hey, if you're actually actively like destroying the planet, let's give you even more money. Let's give you more money. Like, good job. And then it's like, hey, if you're actually doing something beneficial for people, like working in like social, doing some sort of social work or working with people with who need assistance or doing whatever, like you teaching. Yeah. And it's like, so it really shows like, and part of what he talks about with that is like this notion of like, well, your job actually has some meaning. Like, like you should, like, aren't you lucky to look at a job that actually has some meaning? So
Wishbone and I have some experience with that.
Yeah. You don't deserve to be compensated, and it's just like, wow, how can we have our priorities like in reverse in any other way? And and you see the same thing with all these narratives about like you know, I worked hard for this or that, and you know, and you clearly didn't. You just want it for free. You want it for free, and it's like, hell yeah, we do. Like, yeah, we want it for free. Like, wasn't that the whole like 1950s like Jetsons kind of promise of capitalism in the face of communism? It was like, you know, why else do we care about social progress? Why do we care about technological innovation? That's what capitalism was always promising people. We're gonna have fucking flying cars and everyone's going to be great, and post-scarcity, you know, is kind of the mythological promise that I think was really generated behind a lot of people's like minds. But it's also, you know, it is the world that we deserve, and that's now that they don't have some major competition, if they ever did, however you want to look at it. It's like there's no need to, you know, to develop these systems, have these things, and so we're going back to this Mad Max, you know, neoliberal capitalist world until we get some power behind us. And well,
I think one of the most fucked up things about like kind of the revolutionary millenarianism thing is, again, this was a conversation that I just had earlier, and it's so relevant to this, is that it's like every now and then in like lefty Facebook groups or like lefty online spaces, or even in real life, someone will ask the question, what will your job be post-revolution? And I'm sorry, post-revolution, jobs don't fucking exist. Like, I don't want to be thinking, I don't want to be like reduced to 5-year-old me being asked the question of like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's the same question. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up, and what do you want your job to be post-revolution? Same fucking question. I don't want a job. After the revolution, or like in Utopia, we don't have jobs. We do work because we want to like live meaningful lives. We want to help our neighbors. We want to like help our environment and our community, and like
we want to grow as individuals.
Yes. So like the whole concept of like, I want to be the people's janitor seems fucking stupid to me. Like, I'm going to pick up after myself, and I'm going to have the time and the energy to do so because my life and my soul is not being sucked by a 9-to-5, so that there won't have to be a people's janitor. But I can like do all of the other things that I find fulfilling. I love doing dishes. Weird.
You have to give Jeff Bezos billions of dollars. We can't. That's not possible.
Fuck yeah, you're right.
Well, and that's the thing, okay? I mean, people we're so busy arguing, you know, about the scraps that the middle class, such as it continues to exist, and the working class and the impoverished have to scrabble over, when like the amount of wealth that the upper echelons have is just so much. And that it's the same thing when we think about issues around pollution and environmental degradation. It's not, you know, it's not the, you know, we're not going to like, you know, get rid of plastic straws and then, oh no, look, we've solved the Pacific garbage cat. I mean, like these are just barely even drops in a bucket. And don't tell me that like enough drops in the bucket will like give you a whole bucket of whatever. I mean, a bucket is not the ocean. And so we really, you know, we need to stop fighting amongst ourselves about like how much we can conserve, how much we can save, you know, like on an individual level, and start looking at like, what are the real, you know, the real big wasters of energy? What are the real big polluters? What are the real big people who are getting this insane amount of money?
Right.
You know,
what turns to me to something I've been talking to people about lately in different conversations is, you know, like, yeah, like, you know, plastic straws. Like, yes, obviously we should stop using plastic straws.
Sure.
Like, great, like, let's stop using them. Like, I don't think it's a big deal. I don't understand, like, the uproar, you know, like, plastic straw is something we shouldn't use. Okay, great, let's not use it. But still, at the end of the day, it's like, it's not sufficient to solve the problem. And it's like, part of the problem with the left, in my opinion, is like, you know, Kropotkin talked about this, was oftentimes like people, so we have kind of the main end goal, right? Like with revolution, utopia, whatever. But and a lot of times there's like different little ways to get there. And sometimes on the left, we end up like only focusing and talking about the little ways to get there, our little campaigns, our little fights, and fear of like, well, we're going to alienate people by talking about like these bigger ideas. But I think like at the end of the day, it's super important that we like, this is why we need to tap into a radical imagination, why we need to have this sort of utopian thought. And at the end of the day, be, you know, like Fred Hampton said, you know, I am a revolutionary. You're going to have to keep on saying that. You know, we have to keep the end goal of our program sort of like at the forefront. That ultimately, like, what we need is like massive systemic like change, and that's the other thing with like libertarian municipalism is like it's a revolutionary program about building like city-based dual power, you know, structures to wage a battle with the state and capitalism. You know, this isn't while as much as there's evolution and community development and all of these smaller things that have to happen. I think it's important that we have like an understanding of like little drops in the bucket, like are there to maybe show us that we can put enough like water in the bucket or something eventually, but we're gonna have to dump it on someone's head and kick them out of the well. I don't know.
Utopian ice bucket challenge.
Yes.
Okay, not necessarily like what you're getting at, but I do want to say that straws, not necessarily plastic straws, but maybe, are really necessary for people who are paraplegic.
Right.
There's a group. There's a group that needs them.
Well, yeah, there's all kinds of different straws.
Where you going, buddy?
Yeah, where are you going? I don't know what's happening over there.
Just see a butt.
I'm just saying, there's all kinds of different straws that can be made, you know.
I know. Just saying.
So, you know, like this brings us to our next point, which we've already covered a lot, which is just utopia. So, like on here, had a little bit about like talking just about Thomas More, and you know, who's the guy who kind of came up with the idea of utopia, and obviously he's kind of got these weird closed system functionalist kind of goal where he's going, and I think we already kind of covered how our vision of utopia is different from like a social ecology perspective. And so I guess next I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about utopian socialists. A lot of times I don't think as the left we really take a super historical look at like how did the left become divided, right? The divided left. Well, how did it get divided? You know, like where does this come from, right? And so like, you know, and it's a long history that goes back to the Enlightenment. So I might do a little ramble here if that's okay with people.
Go for it.
You know,
I don't know any of this.
you know,
I know this, so I'm gonna dip out for just a second.
Yeah, you have the Enlightenment, like revolutions that happened, and basically, you know, a lot of what was informing that was this liberal capitalist, like bourgeois, like ideology that won out over a lot of the sort of like working class and people that had more ideas for like social programs. And anyways, like, so that's where the term socialist really comes from, is to distinguish itself from the Enlightenment individualist, because individualism was a product of the Enlightenment. So socialism as a term comes from like a necessity to differentiate, right? And so the utopian socialists all came about around like 1810s, 1820s. So the first socialists were utopian socialists. Now, for a lot of them, they actually didn't necessarily believe in class struggle as what was needed to get us to revolution. So while they had these ideas of creating socialist societies, they kind of had some fanciful ideas about basically creating a lot of like utopian communes where people would, you know, escape out and create these new societies. And so you had a lot of that happening all over the world. Some people, going to different places in the world, setting up these communities. That happened actually in the United States. This guy named Robert Owen set up a few in the United States, and most of these communities just ended up being total failures, right? Because obviously you can't just create this idyllic world in the context of global capitalism and its early stages back then. Robert Owen being a major one whose thought really, influenced a lot of the, American anarchists and individualist anarchist tendencies, often cited as one of the first just sort of anarchists in general ahead of Proudhon. So that's kind of the history of the utopian socialists. And, Proudhon comes around and offers, coming from that tendency, the idea of, mutualism, of creating cooperatives to supplant the capitalist system through these alternative mechanisms. And then that kind of became the prevailing method of the early socialist movement. And so for about 20, 30 years, that's what a lot of people were doing. They were building up cooperatives. And it wasn't until the time of Marx and Bakunin that did, the idea of class struggle really come back into play, which for me is an important conception, that there is conflict in these systems. And so that's where the break kind of happens, and between things start breaking up, where you have Kropotkin critiquing Proudhon eventually, and Bakunin originally, and then Bakunin and Marx between authoritarian and anti-authoritarian socialism, state, anti-state. So anyways, I just felt like that was relevant to touch on, because I think at the core of a lot of the early socialist movement, rather or not it was a part of this utopian tendency necessarily of the early socialists, which I would distinguish from what we talk about as well, because we're always evolving and changing in our ideas. Is that back then they had a forward-looking idea of where society should go or could go, right? And that idea of how do we create that?
Well, I think one of the big differences is at one point there was an emphasis on this idea that there was a utopia, that there was a certain one way to do it right. And I think that what we're imagining, and in the tradition of social ecology, is that there will be some grounding principles around non-hierarchy and unity and diversity, and but that the outcome of what a utopia would look like in different places with different people would be different. I mean, that a utopia for one place is not, with one set of people, is not the same utopia that would be in another place with another set of people. And I think that's a really significant difference, like a radical difference, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of this externally imposed, prescribed utopian program is, that doesn't, like you said, it's not for everyone. My idea of what utopia is looks a lot different than what other people's looks like. And that kind of external imposition is kind of again, almost proto-fascist, because hey, here's this person, strong, big man type character, telling you what your founding little commune is gonna run like. And that's obviously not good.
And sorry, were you done?
No, I'm done. Yeah.
Again, this was another conversation that I already had today, is it doesn't necessarily have to even be a strong, a strong individual person. We also need to be thinking about the ways that democracy can even then institute these kind of hierarchical situations.
Yeah.
How are we constructing our democratic structures? Are we talking about a 50% plus one kind of situation? Are we talking about a plurality? Are we talking about consensus? And I think different situations call for different sorts of democratic structures, and I think different communities call for different democratic structures and like a priority of one over the other. And it's about like, it's not necessarily about saying like this is the way you got to do it. It's about like establishing principles of, you know, non-hierarchy, like you said earlier, Slip. And making sure that as people respect those like basic principles, they can then construct society in the image of how is best reflected by their environment, by their like established social norms, et cetera, et cetera. And even then allow space for those things to evolve too.
Right, and you know, I think it's like the Zapatista notion of building a world in which one world in which many worlds fit. Right, it's like the sort of end goal here, where you know, utopia is a process, and but it's something that we have this sort of hopeful end goal that we're striving towards, and you know, like I think it's just so essential to have that kind of underpinning and that hopefulness, right? Because we as like activists who are trying to change the world, we have to actually believe that the world can be changed. You know, if we walk around like, oh, everything's fucked all the time, like, this sucks, like nobody wants to join you, like, you know, because you've already lost, you know, and everybody's already on that page, most people, you know, like from my conversations I have with a lot of people, I enter into a lot of like nihilistic sort of apathy, where it's just sort of like, yeah, everything's fucked. Like I'm. It's not for a lack of information. I'm information overloaded about how shitty the world is, and you know, and my head's dug into the sand, and I'm just trying to survive for me and mine, you know. And so I think that's why it's like revolutionaries. We have to like carry ourselves with like a hopeful disposition and really believe that like we can change the world, and it's like possible, and have a vision for what that other world like could be, you know. And that's a specific term that the Zapatistas use a lot, is like the otro mundo, the other world, you know? And you know, that's just kind of on the other side, you know. It's always potentially there. It's our potential, right? And it's the same thing you see in like the Black radical tradition, whether you're talking about Malcolm X or the Black Panthers or Martin Luther King. You know, it was all informed by a idea, and you know, the Black Panthers said Black power, and all, you know, power, all people,
power to all the power, to all the people, all the power to all the people,
power to all the people. To yeah, and so it's like, you know, so it's about like, how do we get to a place where we have like, you know, like we allow for both self-determination of different peoples, while also like, so for me, it's about like understanding like our difference, learning from our difference, while also like realizing our commonality, whether that's just as human beings or as people stuck in certain class positions, like, you know, like the difference and understanding the difference is really important to enter into conversation. But ultimately, we also have to like have commonality before we have any like basis to think that we can even understand each other. So
the range of that of that commonality, the range of what is universal, however, I think is a point of debate. You know, I find that the amount of difference that I see and that I want folks, myself included, because I'm not always the best, to recognize and deal with and acknowledge and you know, plan differently for, I guess, is I think sometimes more than other folks really just want to see, you know, everybody as the same, and so in so many more ways than makes sense to me. So I feel like that's a point of ongoing debate within, maybe not so much within Demand Utopia, but I would say that was something that came out in some recent, national, international meetings that I was at this past couple weeks.
I think about it like we're universally unique too. It's like humanity. Like we're also like these, super
Universally what?
like we're universally unique also. Like
Unique.
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anyways, like, we'll never really fully be able to tap into someone else's brain and see through their eyes, and everyone has a different subjective take on reality. So I think, at the same time, like, there's commonality and there's difference across like different, larger social groups, but also down to the complete individual. Anyways.
Thomas Nagel has a really great essay called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And he basically just says, like, we can talk about these different, like, ways that a bat can sense the world. We can talk about the ways that a bat can experience the world, but ultimately we're filtering that through our own human perceptions. And we can never actually, like, know what it is like to be a bat, to live a bat's life, and the way that you can kind of extend that is that I can't know what it's like to live, my comrade's life here. I can't know what it's like to live your life, but what we can do is we can, like, create these mutual norms by which we can communicate, like, my life experience, your life experience, and we can also be conscious of the ways that, like, the norms that we create in the moment might not be the norms that we are going to be using next week to talk about a different experience or even the same experience. Like, it's difficult for me to say that the person that I was 10 years ago is the person that I am today, even though that, like, in my head, there's a continuity of like, experience there.
At the same time, I completely agree. At the same time, we know that there are certain kinds of categories of difference that have historically been marginalized or oppressed in certain kinds of ways. So we may not know, like, I may not know what that's like for other people, but I know I have the perspective that I have, and you have the perspective that you have, and there is something generalizable around all of those categories that we know are historically significant. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
I think
we're all squishy little carbon blobs that need love and affection and food, and and I just want to, like, cuddle up most of the time. I think most people want to just, like, be loved and have food and be free, and be nurtured and cared for, and, like, I mean, in a base way, but
sure.
I was going to say something a second ago, but I've forgotten what it was. Oh, now I remember. The Slip, what you were talking about with those generalizations, like, the thing that we need to keep in mind is that, like, yes, we can generalize, and we can generalize even to the point where we are, like, slippery little flesh blobs that need food and affection. But in the same respect, like, within those generalizations, you have to be mindful of the fact that, like, that's a conscious decision that you're making to like, lump all of these experiences into one. But ultimately, even within those separate experiences, there's a vast degree of diversity. Like, your experience as a woman is not going to be the same experience as another woman, or as another woman, or as another woman. My experience as a cis white man is not going to be the same experience as another cis white man, so on and so forth. Like, and all of these different categories of identity and oppression, like, are meaningful in their own way, and we need to be able to, like, talk about them as a group and talk about them in their, like, more atomized senses.
Yeah, I mean, it's different scales, right? Like, there's the way in which we are all you know, we're all universally unique. And then there are ways in which we have some commonalities that have to do with historical trends of oppression and power. And then there are the ways in which, you know, yeah, I mean, like these different scales, right? Like different scales of how much, you know, we want to look at these things, how detailed we need to get, depending upon the situation. You know, I'm meant to be mindful about it.
Yeah, context is really important for when you're talking about these things. And like, there's never a situation where you're removed from context, or you're removed from like experience doesn't happen in a vacuum, or a social vacuum, or a like economic vacuum. Like, they're all interconnected, and it's a matter of like finding out the unique and interesting ways that those interconnections like overlap.
Yeah. Well, I guess next up here, so we've got the idea. So we've talked about dystopia, we've talked about utopia, we've kind of dug into those different things and talked a little bit about like what are different, you know, ways of sort of perceiving reality and all of that kind of stuff, which obviously I think is important to think about, and how we both perceive the world. How do we enter into interactions with other people? And I think those conversations are just super important for us to have, so that we can feel confident, you know, both in entering into dialogue with the other, with whatever that other may be. And, you know, so anyways, our next point was heterotopia, and talking about that. And so heterotopia is kind of this idea of, right, it can be either a sort of dystopia in its traditional sense, or a utopia sort of in its like traditional sense of being places that sort of operate on other rules. And I guess I'll let Amy talk.
No, I can't do it. No, I mean, like, this is not the part of Foucault that I studied. And when I went to my books to look it up, I couldn't find it.
Oh, okay. I'll give everyone a definition here. So Foucault kind of coined the term, but he kind of left it sort of vague. And there's another sort of French the radical urban theorist named Lefebvre, who like explored it like a little bit more, and looking at it through a little bit more of a positive light. But definition of like Foucault is essentially like it's a non-hegemonic space. Non-hegemonic spaces that combine imagined and lived, physical and mental otherness, more layers and meaning that currently meet the eye, can be good and bad. Heterotopia is a physical representation or approximation of utopia or dystopia. So or a parallel space that contains undesirable bodies to make a real utopia or dystopian space possible through that traditional definition of those words. So, for instance, a prison is an example. A mental health, you know, institution, an asylum. These are all places of like heterotopia. Essentially, they're places that have basically a different set of norms and rules from hegemonic society, right? So what is considered like acceptable behavior in a prison or in a asylum are very different than what's considered, you know, quote unquote acceptable behavior when you're walking down a street. So there are these spaces that are sort of kept separate from regular society, often in this negative sense. And then also, so in a positive sense, you can think of spaces such as community gardens, where you have a space with us operating maybe in a different set of rules, or a temporary autonomous zone, a commune, or a occupation, right? And so the question,
A sex club.
yeah, so the question kind of is like, rather not like such spaces are, because we're subjected at life to schools or institutions that kind of operate in this way towards a negative sense, right? And show us this negative kind of inevitability and sets of rules, and you know, like, so what's the is there a need for like creating spaces like this with a liberatory sort of set of the way things are? So if we want, we could show this video real quick. Should we show that one?
Sure, why not? Yeah.
Get it a little bit?
And I'll be quiet.
Is it the boat one or the other one?
The boat one, I think.
I like the boat one.
All right.
Got 1 minute, 30 seconds to talk about philosopher Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopic spaces. Heterotopic spaces, or heterotopias, are real physical or mental spaces that act as other spaces alongside existing spaces. Foucault created 6 principles in order to explain this. Firstly, heterotopic spaces are spaces where norms of behaviour are suspended. Foucault divides this principle into 2: heterotopias of crisis and heterotopias of deviation. Heterotopias of crisis are privileged, sacred, or forbidden spaces reserved for individuals who are in relation to their society in crisis. By that he means adolescents, pregnant women, the elderly. Heterotopias of deviation are places where behaviour outside the norm can be exercised, for example, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, and care homes. The second principle of heterotopic space is that they have a precise and determined function and are reflective of the society in which they exist. Foucault offers a very concrete example of the Western Cemetery. Heterotopic spaces have the power to juxtapose several real places and emplacements simultaneously. The garden is a good example of that, where plants from around the world are juxtaposed together. Heterotopias are linked to slices of time and truly work when people are given a break from their traditional time. Time can either accumulate, in the manner of libraries and museums, or be transitory, like a temporary fairground at the edge of a town. Heterotopic spaces always have a system of opening and closing, and are not really accessible. They require some sort of permission to enter, whether with a ticket, a gesture, or some kind of ritual. Heterotopias have a function in relation to other spaces that exist. They are either spaces of illusion, Foucault offers us the example of the brothel, I have to take his word for that, or spaces of compensation, such as the 19th century English colonies in the New World. Finally, Foucault offers us the boat as the perfect example of a heterotopia, which is a floating piece of space, not fixed to any other place, except the infinity of the sea.
It made a lot of sense this time.
Yeah. So, like, what are people's thoughts on that? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think we need those kinds of places because they're like training zones in some ways, or they're experimental places, you know, where people can try things on and see how they go. You know, I mean, like, I feel like this particular example I'm going to use is not one that I think is particularly great, but, you know, like, let's think about Burning Man and ways in which, you know, the rules of the rules of the normal world the everyday world in which we live are in many ways suspended there for people who can afford it.
yeah.
But yeah.
One of the things that
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that one of the things that immediately jumped to my mind, and that has also been a lot in the Seattle kind of news cycle a lot, is the Bezos balls. You know, this, for folks who don't know, Amazon's world headquarters is here, and outside one of their main buildings, Jeff Bezos built this giant, like, they're like 3 connected spheres, and they're filled with exotic plants from around the world. Places that are being deforested, destroyed in various ways. And it's supposed to offer this getaway from bustling city life, working as a peon in Amazon's fucking machine. But there's been so much good, like, philosophy, like, coming out of people analyzing the existence of these like this imperial garden that sits in the middle of Seattle. It's just outrageous and really interesting.
Most importantly, the balls are where Jeff Bezos stores his pee.
He stores his pee there?
Yeah, pee is stored in the balls.
On the chat. I don't know if y'all can see the chat for some reason.
Yeah.
I can't see the chat at all.
The screen. I don't know what's going on with that. We'll have to try to figure that out, but I have it up here. And Flame Garden says, it strikes me that the internet is a heterotopia and communitopia is a heterotopia within that heterotopia. And
So meta.
I was going to say, Flame Garden, thank you. That's like what I was thinking and hoping that, what we're doing is because I was recently reading a article talking about Facebook as a heterotopia in the way that you have this different set of rules and relationships that people come in and operate in both this sort of imagined and real space, right? And a lot of these things are like illusion combined with like compensation or like real life, and so operating in relation to that. And so I think like, for me and I think for a lot of us, like everybody spends a lot of time on the internet, on Facebook, on these different forums, and and there's no, it's as real as any of the other places we're in. It's as real as the interactions we have. The question is how kind are we to each other and stuff like that oftentimes. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to sort of create those spaces of interaction and other worldliness, whether that's online or that's again like our counterparts are doing it with Bezos balls, and so I think it's like extremely important. Here in Portland we had the Occupy Ice Camp that went, and we went down there as the Man Utopia and set up a garden, and some people did affiliated with the group, and so it was a really cool space for some of us going down there and being able to engage with people and talk and stay there for long extended periods of time and live in a space. A lot of people start calling it like the Portland commune, and it was really a space where people ran by people power, where people kind of designed and set up the rules, and rather it functioned definitely didn't function all of the time. People had difference and conflicts, but it was that space where people were able to come together and really see what it's like to be able to build something together and to live together. And I think part of that is when we really set aside the way that capitalism divides up our lives and parses us out as people and humans and our consciousness and our time. What is it really like to be in a space where we live together and we make the rules like 24/7, right? Like those are really important questions. And oftentimes when we enter into those spaces, because we're not living in Rojava or some of these other places maybe where people have lived in more organic communities where they are working with the people they live with often. We are faced with like particular challenges, and yet like I think the more that we can create those kinds of spaces, the more that we can show it's possible to work together, to make something, to struggle together, and the deeper that we go together and the more committed we become as we sort of trauma bond in the face of this oppressive fucking system.
I'm kind of struck by like we talked, I think Dearheart mentioned earlier about how our lovely friends at Seriously Wrong talk about utopes a lot, like this idea of like here's this small little piece of a utopian world that we have brought into existence here, where that might already exist, and that I feel like that crosses over very significantly with this idea of the heterotopia and like these institutions that could be as simple as like a group of people getting together to cook a meal for homeless folks, or like you know, holding like a education session at like a public park, or even just having a regular thing at a public park to begin with.
Organizing your workplace.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I think that I think like, you know, community cookouts are a great example, and like organizing your workplace. Like, I think if you get it organized, you know, that can be maybe an example, and then it's also like the process of organizing, I think is one that could be fueled or furthered by like exposing your fellow workers to these different types of spaces, you know, and that's the thing that I think it can serve a role in, is sort of fertilizing and empowering.
There's a couple other terms that I didn't mean to cut you off, Steen.
Go ahead.
There's a couple other terms I think that might be useful here to think with, and they're deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So like the idea, when I'm thinking about organizing your fellow workers, it's a practice of those two things, where you are taking away, or you're remaking the space in new way. You're remaking the space through a new way of imagining it. Whereas before, like, you know, the dominant way of understanding the workplace may have been, you know, I'm at the mercy of this business for employment, for health benefits, for other things that the workplace provides. I need to have this job. And I am like a powerless individual in relationship to the big corporation or just the owners. That it's reterritorializing that space as a space where the worker is the one that's empowered, where the workers together have more power than the owners or the corporate, because we are the ones doing the work. We're the labor power as the workers. So that there's a kind of, we can make heterotopias through this process of reterritorialization, we can make heterotopias out of normative spaces.
And I think this also kind of dovetails into a conversation about anti-fascism as well, in the sense that, like, there's a vulgar form of anti-fascism where it's just like, we got to kick the fascists out of the park. We need to like go punch Nazis, which, like, those actions are important if Nazis are trying to take space, if fascists are trying to create space for themselves. But ultimately, the best form of anti-fascism is creating a society that doesn't allow for those kinds of, like, beliefs and tendencies to grow. And so it's like, in a way, it's like, you know, you're deterritorializing your community from, like, the inherent fascism within state policing,
Right.
or like the kind of, this might be a controversial statement, but like the almost anti-fascist, or the almost, like, I'm trying to think of the way to word this.
Proto-anti-fascist? All proto-anti-fascist?
Well, no, I was more thinking about in terms of, like, how state-owned public utilities are, in a way, a form of, like, hierarchy, in the sense that it's difficult to, like, get off of the water grid if you are within, like, the boundaries of the city limits. And so it's like, it's about thinking about, like, how these resources are used and how they are to be used in a community sense and in an individual sense. And I don't know if I really made my point very well. But, like, ultimately, it's really important when you're talking about anti-fascism to point out that, like, it's not enough to be against Nazis.
Yeah.
It's not enough to be against, like, Italian-style fascists or white supremacists. You need to be able to fill that space once those people have moved on. And I think a lot of liberals miss that point. Like, and I think, and even like kind of conservatives that think of like the US as defeating fascism or whatever, or even like, you know, anti-fascists on the left, like you need to have a vision to put in place of whatever that power vacuum exists once those people are removed, once those ideas are removed, once that like kind of systematized cruelty is removed from the community.
This conversation kind of struck me. There was a post on It's Going Down like 3 weeks ago that I just pulled up on my phone. It's called Supporting Street Actions with Labor and Economic Campaigns. And it's basically like the authors are saying kind of what Dearheart was saying, like, you know, it's important to counter fascism when they're trying to organize in public and physical space, but this more sustainable and long-term method of anti-fascism is organizing your community, right? Building that heterotopia where like fascism can exist. Because if they try to come in, you know, the DC Metro Workers Union will strike if the cops try to make them give a train to white supremacists, or you know, various labor unions like passing policies that they'll explicitly kick out any worker who is a white supremacist or fascist.
Yeah, we had that happen in Portland with some labor groups that got organized, a bunch of trade unions to, you know, take explicit stances against fascism and kick people out who are fascists. And you know, and I think that's like all those points are so spot on, because you know, we can't just be responsive like in our organizing. We can't just be you know, doing disruptive power, because there's different forms of power that we can wield. There's constructive and there's sort of disruptive, you know, and without having like constructive power where we're building things that can, institutions or heterotopic spaces that can expose like that other world, and you know, the defensive aspects are just stuck in this realm of just warding off what feels like the inevitable like encroachment and, you know, of these forces that we're against. And so yeah, I mean, you know, with Demand Utopia, that's part of what we've tried to do with, you know, some of our engagement in some of these things, showing up in giant bubble sunflower suits. You know, we'll both defend and we'll imagine like a new world. You know, and I think a lot of this stuff, a lot of this fascist reaction, we have to remember. You know, there's a reason why we call these people reactionaries, and it's because you know, we've had like since the rise of like Black Lives Matter, which has been assisted, I think, partially by, you know, people's ability to organize through new technologies and to expose new realities of, you know, what's happening to people in this country, Black people being, you know, assassinated by the state, and people, you know, taking the streets. And so a lot of Trump's rhetoric and this far right stuff was originally directed at, you know, Black Lives Matter, the movement, and this sort of thing coming about, you know, and it's no surprise that then the next boogeyman is Antifa, you know, and
Yeah.
right after the Trump election, and, you know, in Portland, we had mobilization after mobilization of thousands and thousands of people in the streets, a really budding sort of movement, just, you know, even if it was just encapsulated to testing what these people are about. You know, part of probably the problem is it didn't take on more of an imaginative, reconstructive idea. But, you know, these fascists are coming about to in Portland, like Joey Gibson comes from him coming down here, and some of these militia guys doing citizens arrests on people and so on and so forth. So it's like, you know, we can't just be in this defensive place all of the time. Rather, it's however we want to look at it, and we have like kind of emergency hearts, I think, in the left, as Scott Crow, you know, coins that term of like jumping from thing to thing, like, we gotta stop this thing, we gotta stop that thing, you know, and at a certain point we only have we have to choose our battles, you know. And for me, it's like Guerrilla War by Che Guevara. Like, you only choose the battles you know you're going to win. And I think if we start thinking like that a little bit more, and choosing and defending as well, but also moving forward with more positive programs, rather that's, you know, building directly democratic assemblies or these heterotopias, and pushing towards, you know, new visions that we construct and present to people, right? Of like, hey, actually, we are going to make this like badass like platform or whatever on like completely changing our entire city government or city council. We're gonna get rid of the city council, and now the city's gonna be ran by fucking, you know, democratic neighborhood assemblies or whatever. Like, I don't know what it takes. Like, however we create like poison-less democracy. I think presenting those things to people, and as crazy as it might sound, you can't do that. You know, it's like, well, they're building fucking walls and winning and doing all kinds of shit no one thought was possible. So I think we need to get more bolder with what we demand, and the realities that we talk about, more honest with people, you know, in those day-to-day interactions about the way the world is, even if it comes across as a crazy guy in a green mask screaming and or talking to you politely about the idea I think about.
I think another.
Anyways, I just wanted to. I don't want to include this person's in the chat in the conversation real quick. I know I just went on, but Steven says, so to return to the heterotopian thing, if that's okay. How do you think we can create more permanent spaces, or do you think that's even possible in this period? Is it more important that we plan temporary places so that we can see how it works for us first? Just wanted to put it out there.
Is it more important that we what? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your.
Yeah. Can you turn down the volume on your speaker? Because I think your mic's picking it up.
Yeah. So the question was, how do you think we create more permanent spaces? Or do you think that's even possible in this period? Is it important that we form temporary places so that we see how it works first? And this was on the topic of the heterotopia discussion.
I think I've got a good answer for this one. I think it's both, right? Like, in Seattle, we're talking a lot about, you know, housing. Housing is a big fucking issue in the city. You know, there's people being displaced all over the place because there's gentrification everywhere. And, you know, there's been this recurring theme of people wanting to set up things like community land trusts and like expand the cooperative housing network, like dramatically, right? And, you know, various like other forms of alternative housing. And, you know, our housing world is very much similar to like the rest of the shitty state that society is in, very atomized and stuff like that. And it is really daunting because the average house price in Seattle is like $1 million.
And the average rent is like 1,200, 15 or something. I have a very lucky living arrangement right now.
Yeah. And to kind of like address the point more directly, like a lot of these institutions that we're talking about don't necessarily like need any like impetus to be started. Like a lot of the community land trusts and such that exist in Washington have been around for like 30 or 40 years, and just been kind of slowly growing for most of that time. And now that the housing situation is as bad as it is, they've started to get a lot more growth, because people are starting to see like, oh, this is a more permanent institution that we could have more housing in. But at the same time, like those of us who don't have the fortune to own a house or otherwise be stable in housing for longer than a few months at a time, still, I think, have this kind of prefigurative vision of wanting to experiment, short term with things like housing co-ops or like collectives and that kind, or even squats. Like squats are a great example of that, for being this kind of ephemeral, probably short term, not really permanent form of housing. And I think actually Dan Chodorkov's book that he wrote talks about this a lot, in a way. But I think that's all I got.
You mean Loisaida?
Yes, Loisaida.
I think another thing to consider is that, like, what is meant by temporary and permanent? Like, I can't point to a single thing in human history that we can call permanent. It's all ultimately temporary. Like, you and I are ultimately temporary. And so, like, if the question is whether, what are the things that we need to do to, like, kind of get this ball rolling, like, to like put us on a like downward slope towards utopia, so to speak, in the sense that, like, you put the ball on the slope, it's gonna roll down no matter where, like, it could roll left, right, whatever, but it's ultimately gonna go to the bottom of the hill. Like, I don't know what that's gonna look like. And I think, and I personally, I can understand why people would not agree with this, but I personally find that more liberatory than, like, an actual, like, plan towards it. Like, ultimately, to me, and this again might be a very personal thing, like, having multiple options towards, like, the other world, the better society, whatever you want to call it, is way more promising. Yeah, I think that was all I was going to say.
I just want to say I super agree, dear heart, like big time with that. If we were to think that we knew, if we were to like plan it, this goes back to what we were saying before, like there's going to be different, different worlds are going to be utopias for different places. And if we think that we've got it figured out, then we're definitely wrong. So it's all about, just trying and then looking at what you tried and reassessing and trying again. And it's a constant process of always adapting to changing circumstances, to changing contexts.
Right. And like that's essential sort of thinking for me. And whether you call it dialectics or call it whatever you want to call it, like, to me, that sort of disposition or outlook is what I'm interested in. In the sense of, I went to a talk a number of years ago by actually Fred Hampton Jr., where he was asked, like, by a person in the audience, is Pan-Africanism sort of the solution? His response was like, well, he's like, that was that one time, like, the vocabulary we used, and it made sense for what, and those ideals for our time. But he's like, when I'm out in the streets doing, community organizing, I change my vocabulary like every single day. Like, so it's always changing. And for me, that's why I like within this whole social ecology internet realm, there's like this idea of like neighborhood scientists, and it's like, for me, as revolutionaries, in terms of like, for a lot of different reasons, I think it's really important that we think about things in the context of being scientists, of like our different efforts are experiments, like we were literally tasking ourselves with like, however you ultimately want to look at it, we're tasking ourselves with the most difficult task in human history, of transforming like the legacies of thousands of years of oppression and domination and capitalism, racism, and all of these things. That this is not to mention the state forms of the police and military industrial complex. Like, this is a huge order, and so we're going to fail. But that's the thing, is like, on the path of success, like everybody, you have to fail and you have to be willing to like keep going. So, you know, so we can't look at this in terms of that one big moment, you know, or that one big thing. And then I see a lot of people looking at it that way. People get disheartened and disillusioned. But, you know, on the question of permanence or non-permanence, like I think we need kind of a combination of both trying to really intentionally develop like long-term like community dual power institutions and all of that kind of stuff that we talk about a lot in the left days. And I think we also need to like return to some stuff that was going on maybe a few decades ago or more, where we are looking at more temporary spaces and festive things. And or, you know, on that note, but towards the permanent side would be like communes. Like I think there's a place to play in the role. I would like to see like communes on the peripheries of cities where like land is cheap, where people can set up like spaces that can operate in alternative ways, and where people can practice these things and develop skills, and then return to the sort of urban terrain to you know make it happen. Like I know for me, when I go to conferences or I go to radical events like that and meet other comrades and have an opportunity to like do stuff like when it's happening out in the woods and stuff, or even like Autonomous Mutant Festival is a kind of radical DIY like music festival that happens out in the woods, and people decorate space all differently, and it's just you can feel people building space. And I think for me, that's part of the Rights of the City stuff that I think is really important, is that it's a human right to shape the space around you, to shape and build that physical space, you know, because that's part of our humanity is seeing ourselves reflected in the spaces around us. And that's, you know, that ability is why they've implemented the structures of gentrification and urban renewal as explicit structures to counteract like organizing against structures of segregation that they had set in place, and discrimination and oppression. And as people figured out how to, you know, organize collectively and were emboldened to do it and took control of their spaces, that's when we see these new structures implemented that are really founded in colonial counterinsurgency methods. But that's a topic of another podcast episode, maybe. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just, you know, we have to cultivate in people both like a feeling of control over their space and an idea of a better world. I think those are important things. So it's 8:45. Do we have any other thoughts that people wanted to explore? We have a little Utopia versus Dystopia music video that we can share with people on our way out. So I guess any closing thoughts or comments, chat?
I just want to say this is also current events, but fuck John McCain.
There you go.
Building off of that, though, like a really disturbing trend that I've seen on the left in response to John McCain's death, like I wanted to make it very clear and echo my dear friend's sentiments. Fuck John McCain, but like there's this weird sense of like cruelty that and like just visceral celebration in the suffering that goes into cancer. And I have a big problem with that, like knowing people in my life who have died from cancer. Like I don't wish that upon anybody. I don't wish that upon any person. I don't wish dealing with a cancer patient upon like their family, because it's heartbreaking and it is devastating, and it's like genuinely a life-changing experience to watch someone you love and someone who like has an incredible like mind and spirit be reduced to a gibbering mess. And like I totally understand why like the deep sense of schadenfreude associated with like someone dying from an illness that he like actively organized against other people receiving the same treatment. But in the same respect, like, cancer is not a joke. I'm sorry. Like, I'm taking a very personal and strong stance against that. And like, I really wish people would be more mindful about like the collateral damage that like cancer can cause. Yeah, that's it. That's just been on my mind like all fucking day.
I think it's a good point. I think, like, addressing the tendency of just like cruelty in the left, and the way that we kind of cultivate this just like militant hold disposition sometimes and put like really high like value on it, can be often like very sort of performative. And while it's like, John McCain being this person who's perpetuated like massive harm in like so many different ways, like isn't a figure that is really deserving of a whole lot of empathy. But at the same time, like, I totally hear what you're saying with that. I think it's an important kind of tendency to call out. And again, like, would be a cool podcast episode in the future. Cruelty and myths in the left. Because I've actually been to talks at different anarchists. I went to a talk at the Seattle Anarchist Book Fair probably like 5 years ago, and there was a panel by this certain group affiliated with the Black Heart, and their whole thing was total embracement of cruelty and total cruelty for your enemies and dividing, your family and your friends.
I know what group you're talking about.
Total cruelty against people, and to me, it's the opposite of this sort of like philosophy that really works, I think, for actual insurgent movements. And whether you're looking at Rojava or the Zapatistas or any movement needs to have people who show dignity. And I mean, if you look at the writings of like George Jackson, the famous political prisoner who's is the inspiration for the ongoing prisoner strike right now. Like a lot of the people from that era, they would show everybody with dignity, basic human dignity, and a basic level of respect. B.P. Newton as well was we talk about a lot. So I think like, that sort of way, again, of like how we handle ourselves and how we communicate and even talk about our enemies, is communicating to everybody around us about who we are, and are we people who, exert cruelty? That's going to scare people away. Or are we people who really believe in humanity's transformative potential and there's potential to change? That doesn't mean that there's some people who will never change, but that's my rant again, I guess.
Slip, do you have anything you want to add?
I guess I'll just add that we demand utopia now because the alternative is global annihilation. I think that that's, really the case. And I want us all to spend some more time thinking about what utopia looks like to each of us, and imagining that, and imagining all the ways we can create spaces for that in now, and then figure out how to institutionalize them so that when we get to if it comes to like everything falls apart, that we have all of the things that we need in place to institute the better world, rather than like end up in Mad Max land. I want us to make these things now, because I don't want to be in Morton Joe's, milk provider. So that's a great movie also to talk about, like Utopia, some other time.
What movie is that? What movie is that?
Oh, Mad Max Fury Road is.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Terrific story about about Utopia, and that Utopia is not a place you can find. It's a place that you have to make. So the whole story, you know, of Mad Max Fury Road is, you know, she's trying to like get away with the wives and Max and that one reformed war boy to find the good place, to find the green place. And when she finds the women that she remembers from there, they're like, it doesn't exist. And the whole thing is you have to go back. You have to work where you're at. You have to make it real where you're at. And so I really appreciate the end of that movie where we see that team, you know, rising up, you know, like into the fortress to figure out how to make that happen. Because there's no place you can go. You have to get now here.
We're all stuck. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? We're all stuck here together until the end. Hey! All right. Well, if any other closing comments before I switch over to our cool video at the end? All right. Well, thanks to everybody who is in the chat for participating in the conversation with us. We're going to be doing this every last Sunday of the month, and so we'd love to have y'all jump back in here again for the conversation. Hopefully we'll have it figured out so you can, all of the people on here can talk. If you want to plug more into Demand Utopia, visit our website. We are starting in the future a really cool program to kind of gamify activism a little bit and plug
Pretty awesome
in a fun way. And we want to like work with you all and plug you into stuff. So hit us up, demandutopia@protonmail.com. Check out our website, demandutopia.net, if you haven't already. So we are going to go ahead and hit the video. Thanks so much, everybody. You're awesome. You're beautiful. You're amazing. Utopia. Now.
Utopia. Although when we wake up, but this is all we get. This is what we get. Only about life, but still think strongly about death. Utopia, 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 utopia. Utopia, 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 utopia. Higher source is calling and you don't have to commit. You don't have to submit. Future works upon us if we all work upon it. Utopia, 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 utopia. dystopian.